All right, the time is 2:55 p.m. Eastern Time. I would like to now introduce Diane Walsh of Northrop Grumman. She'll be talking to us today about successful implementation and management of a software product line. Diane.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Diane Walsh. I work for the space systems sector and the payload and ground systems division at Northrop Grumman. I'm going to share some of our experience with implementing and managing a software product line today. Next slide. Okay, so what will we be talking about today? First, I'll give you a little background about what my organization does, and then talk a little bit about the motivation for why we decided to go with this product line stuff. Then also some software architecture considerations that went into it, talk about some different staffing models for product lines, and then talk specifically about the approach that we decided to take for our product line. And then finally, we'll finish up with some lessons learned. So let's get started. Next slide, please. Okay, so what does my organization do? Our business unit builds RF sensors for space payloads. And then my team specifically develops the flight software that runs on those payloads. We receive the commands that are sent to the payloads. We task the sensor and we collect the mission data from that sensor and then make that mission data available for further processing. So we write the software for that, and then we support the payloads once they are delivered. And that can mean uploading new features on orbit, and then also the occasional bug fixes that crop up. Next slide. So why software product lines? And what it came down to is that we were in a position where we really felt that we had to. A little over 2 years ago, we had several programs that were starting up all at once, and they had a lot of common functionality and requirements. And in the past, our past approach, we would typically be designing and developing the software on separate program networks. A lot of times they were in classified networks, so all the code was segregated. And we were having to rewrite the same pieces of code over and over again. And then oftentimes finding the same bugs over and over again and having to fix those bugs multiple times and continuing to maintain the software in all those different places. And then in addition, we were looking at several programs at the same time needing the same thing, and it just didn't seem to make sense to have multiple people adding the same capabilities and having a bunch of duplicate work. So we felt that there really must be a better way to do this. And also we definitely want to continuously improve our software processes. How can we be more efficient so we can be competitive in being able to deliver software in a cost-effective manner? So this really led us to realizing it was time for a new approach. Next slide. Okay, so to create our software product line, it was really based on identifying what's the common functionality across all of these different systems. We took a look at all the different program requirements and identify what was common. We were able to develop one architecture that would satisfy the needs of all these different products. And then we took that and translated it into a roadmap of common agile features that we could work off and add to our product. And then the key was that all these features would be developed once and maintained in one central location, available for multiple programs. Next slide. So some architectural considerations. We have a component-based architecture. It's very important to have clear responsibilities assigned to different components, and then going along with that is to have well-defined and controlled interfaces between those components so we can plug different things in and out. It's also important to us to make sure that we segregated the things that were common and the things that were mission specific. So an example might be the piece of software that's receiving the commands from our bus. We don't always have a lot of control over the ICD with our bus, so it was important to make sure that that was a separate component that had the responsibility of just interpreting that ICD to feed it into the rest of the system. Next slide. And then also it was important to have a layered architecture where we had a clear hierarchy of dependencies between them. We have a Linux OS on the bottom, and building on top of that, an event-driven middleware. And then on top of that, we have common utilities that are available to all of our applications, different libraries and then message interfaces between them, some hardware services. Saying on top of that, we had common applications that are used to manage a system and to implement the functionality common across them. And then finally, on top of that is where programs could add their mission-specific pieces of how they're controlling their specific sensor with their specific hardware. In between the common pieces and the mission-specific pieces, we also had extension points. So the common processes provide interfaces where the programs can plug in implementations that are specific to their program. Next slide. Okay, so staffing models. There are basically two different staffing models that you can have when you're executing a product line. One is a centralized team model and one is a decentralized team model. And both have their pros and cons, and it might depend on where you are with your product to determine which one to pick. A centralized team model has a team that is devoted to just working on the product. So the programs identify what features they need, but they bring that to the product team. The product team works on developing that and put it in the product baseline and feed that back out to the programs. And we found that this is very helpful, like if you're just starting off with your product, because you can really focus on, being efficient and building up that product and maximizing staff devoted to it. The other model is the decentralized team model. In that case, you don't have a central team working on it. The work instead is passed out to the project team. So the projects that need the features are the ones that are implementing it, but they are still contributing it back to the same product baseline. You still have a product owner whose job it is to determine, is this appropriate for the product line? Is it compatible with the architecture? And this is very similar to how open source works. Anyone can contribute to it, but there's still someone in charge deciding if this is a good fit for the product. Both models can coexist, but we found it to be simpler if you choose one model at a time, and just to not complicate things as much. Next. Okay, so how do we decide to get started? Because we were just building up this product, we felt it was important to start with a centralized team. And that would allow us to really focus on not just writing code, but really establishing it as a product. We wanted to go through the rigor of making sure we had requirements defined for our product and map them to the features, have an emphasis on building a product architecture. A lot of this was predicated around making sure that we had our process worked out correctly, that we were following our agile software development process. We had our CM environment set up to support multiple programs, making sure that our JIRA workflows worked for it. And then also we wanted to have a focus on figuring out, well, how can we deliver a quality product and work towards delivering test artifacts and data that will help us to verify the build. And in the future, as we continue to evolve, we're working on adding automated tests for our software builds when we deliver our product and having that done with continuous integration. So for us, we felt it was very important just to have that product focus as we were starting out. Next slide. Okay, so team coordination. How does this work across all these different teams? So we had our centralized product team, but then you also have each project will still have their team, and each project has a product owner, and they're prioritizing their agile backlog of work and identifying what features they need for their releases. So then those product owners were working with me as the product captain to identify, here are the features that we need to go into the product line, and here's when we need it for. And so then we would develop our roadmap to make sure that those features got in at the appropriate times. Programs still have needs for need dates for their own releases, and that may be different from another program, but that's not something that we shy away from. That we support that when they need releases, we make the releases. And then in terms of funding, that was coordinated with the product captain across the stakeholders, so that for each feature, the program that needed that feature would provide a charge number, and that allowed it an easy way for that program to track earned value by just keeping track of the progress against that feature. Next, please. Okay, so funding aspects for a centralized team. There are basically two areas that need to be addressed. One is the technical features that get added to the products. And that is, usually an easy sell because it's very tangible. You're getting new functionality that is going into the product that the projects need. And like I said, we worked with mapping one Agile feature to one stakeholder charge number to accommodate that funding. But then the other part of it is the management and the infrastructure that goes around having this separate product line team. So for the management of the team and then what the team members should charge when they're not working a feature, having the funding to cover a product owner and having, providing that leadership, technical oversight of the product, support roles for configuration management and mission assurance. And also because we're developing this for reuse across multiple products, we had to factor in additional extensibility into some of our software designs, which can make it slightly more complex. And then we still have pop-up bugs that occur that we need to address. And then wanting to have good DevSecOps practices with continuous builds and deployments and testing. And then finally, Agile ceremonies like Scrum and sprint planning that you would have on any team. So it's usually easy to get the funding for the technical features, but then we had to work with our stakeholders more to make sure that we were covered for the product management aspect of it. Next, please. Okay, so some funding resolutions. As we were starting out, since this was our first time, we did receive some internal funding so we could collect the metrics on the overhead that it took to run this as a separate team. And we did track the resources required to execute that team beyond the technical development staff. In terms of dealing with the extensibility that needs to go into the products, we made the decision that that would just kind of be baked into the stories as we were working, and that's part of the contract of developing within our product line. And then for the Agile ceremonies, we worked out an agreement that the stakeholder programs would fund the number of heads based on the number of story points that they were funding within a release. So if they were funding about 40% of the points within a release, then we would ask them to fund 40% of the heads for what they would for their time spent in the Agile ceremonies, which is really not that much different from if those developers had been working on the project's Agile teams. And that seemed to work out pretty well and be pretty fair. Next slide, please. Okay, so some realized financial benefits. Collected metrics over our first year, which showed that this approach is definitely worthwhile. We started out with 3 equal stakeholder programs. And if you compare their cost with what it would have taken if they had developed 100% of this software on their own, they were only paying for 33% of the development cost. And then there was an 8% of the original cost to cover the overhead of the team management. But still adding that up, that was a savings of 59% from what they would have paid if they were doing all that software development on their own. And then after that first year, we had a 4th program come along, and they saved 100% of the cost of all that software that had been funded by the first 3 programs. And as more programs come on, they just keep gaining more and more benefit of the work that has come before them. Next, please. Okay, some additional benefits. We found that having the shared software development approach significantly shortened our timeline to launch. We had some very aggressive schedules at this time, and we really believe that following this process is what allowed us to be successful with those, because by having one team focus on all the common functionality, the project teams were then able to go focus on the things that were specific to their mission. Our Agile process allowed us to find significantly fewer defects during INT for our first program, and then right away, subsequent programs, they benefited from that defect resolution. That code had already been proven by the first program out of the gate. So in fact, our second program did not find any significant defects in our product line software during their INT phase. When that 4th program came on, we were able to onboard them with getting software on a board in our lab in less than 1 week. And they started off right from the bat with basic functionality in it that they could handle commanding and telemetry, state management, things like fault management. So they really had fairly robust functionality right from the get-go. And another benefit we have found is that our engineers now are very familiar with the software baseline as they move between programs. It's the same design, and that lessens the learning curve that they have to go through as they come up to speed on a new program. Next slide. And just to give you an idea of the scope of our product line, we started with 3 stakeholder programs in late 2018, early 2019. One was an IRAD and 2 were customer funded. We started our centralized team at the beginning of 2019 and maintained that just till this past fall. And then as our product became more mature, we felt it was time to split it into a distributed team. So that's how we're operating now under that distributed model. We have about 101K of slack as of the end of last year. While we had the centralized team, we were making releases from the centralized team every 3 months to deliver to our program teams. Now that we've moved to a distributed model, the programs are really driving when they need the releases, and yeah, that's driven by their program schedules. Okay, next slide. Okay, and some lessons learned. One is that your stakeholders must be willing to work with you through the process. You will really need to convince them because this is a different way of doing business, a different mindset. So you have to, educate everyone, get everyone on board. But we're hopeful that using like our experience here is something that can help sell that to other people. Funding is definitely challenging. It requires a lot of coordination with the stakeholders to make sure that you have all your features accounted for in agreement and making sure it's a fair split between your programs. So that takes some discussion to work all that out. It's definitely important to stick with it and help your stakeholder understand the process and benefits, that they can see, like slides like I showed before, that look how much money you actually save by doing it this way. And also, for the process to help work through it with them and make sure that the process is meeting everyone's needs. And then another thing we found more on the technical side was that it was very important to involve our stakeholders in the design process. The stakeholders on those project teams are the ones that are most familiar with their requirements and their needs. So you need to make sure that you're involving them in your discussions as you're coming up with the solution. And it's also important to have stakeholders from multiple teams so you can make sure that you're coming up with a solution that's going to be satisfactory to multiple parties. We definitely found that having the centralized team in the beginning was helpful to allow us to focus on building this up as a true product and allow us to have a mindset of designing it for reuse. But we did find that after we had a very strict centralized team approach for a while, we did need to put a little bit of flexibility in it because sometimes we were constrained by staff. So sometimes some of our stakeholder projects would need the ability to work a little faster to get something flowed back into the product lines. Then we worked with them to allow them to make those contributions. And then as we moved further on and the product was more mature, we had fewer features that were coming in. So we felt like it was the appropriate time to split into the decentralized team model. And that would give the programs more control over, when they needed to insert features into the product line. This is definitely a work in progress. And so we are always applying our agile principles for continuous process improvements. And I think that's definitely been one of the things that we have spent a lot of time in discussion on, like making sure we have our process solid so that we can make this as smooth for everyone involved and make sure we're meeting everyone's needs. Also, it's important to understand that it's not the product line's place to tell the programs not to do things. Our role is to actually help them to figure out how do we do it, how do we get it into the product line and make it compatible with architecture and able to suit the needs of many different products. And finally, our biggest lesson learned is that this really works. We were able to launch our systems on aggressive schedules, and we have our common product line software flying and operational right now in multiple systems. So this has definitely been a beneficial change for our department and something that we really believe in going forward. So with that, I'm willing to take any questions. Thank you.
All right, excellent presentation, Diane. We do have a few questions, and I happen to think this is an incredibly relevant topic. So the first question is from Chris Heastand. How do you handle code that is specific to a mission? Do you try to keep multiple configurations or branches going, or is all of it common software, 100% common?
The code that is specific to a mission would be developed and maintained by the project teams, and they have a separate repository, and that is segregated from our product line software. The product line software itself is truly common and controlled in one repository, and the intention is that the project should not have to change the common code.
How did those two repositories coexist in the project?
We work with Git, and we submodule the common code into the project repository.
Do you have any complexities or challenges with submodules?
There's a little bit of a learning curve, but it's worked pretty well for us, I think. Once everyone gets used to the mechanics of just making sure they're looking at the right commits, but it does seem to be working pretty well.
I would love to chat with you offline about that. We are also using submodules and have some tools that are open source that I'd love to get your take on.
Okay.
Next question from Chris Knight. How do you ensure decentralized teams feed back into the product baseline?
So that is a challenge. I think a lot of it has to do with that being a constant message and having management support for that, to be like, this is how we have to do business now. It really is important, I think, to have a unified front on making sure that that's the message that's getting out, and also both from management and from our senior technical leaders.
And my addition to that question is, mechanically, how is that done? Is that simply that the project has their own fork of that repository, and then they can push changes across the two different instances?
No, everyone's working off of the same like Nix build branch, and then when they are ready to contribute something, we have pull requests that come in, and then as the product owner, I'm reviewing that, and we have other technical SMEs who review it. And even prior to that, before we get to the point of doing a code review, we're working together to review like architectural changes and the design of the software to make sure it's appropriate, to come into the baseline. It's not something that we want to have a surprise necessarily, like at the very end, and be like, oh no, this code isn't suitable for it.
And now, maybe you said this before, but do the individual projects have branches in the common repository?
The only time we have branches is if they have like gotten to a point where they kind of have to freeze their release, and because they're about to about to be launched, and that's the release they're going to fly with, and then we may have a branch off of it just for bug fixes. But in general, like if you're keeping up with wanting new features, you should be following along with the main branch of our code, of the common code.
Okay. Next question from Lee Garbs. Any thoughts on how the process can handle or not handle a particularly unresponsive but perhaps well-meaning stakeholder or stakeholders?
Like an unresponsive stakeholder in terms of not wanting to participate, I guess. I know, like as a product owner, I try to work with each project's product owner and have those conversations to make sure that we're keeping the lines of communication open. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Yeah, I guess maybe, do you find that the projects generally are pretty open to the idea and they play nice?
For the most part. I mean, I think we do sometimes have challenges because it does take longer or a little more thought to contribute a feature back, rather than just kind of putting your blinders on to get just your program done. So that is a challenge, and it is like a culture shift, I think, change in mindset that we have to work on. I do think that we have a lot of advocates in our department, who recognize the value in this. And then also, like from an engineering perspective, it's not fun to write the same stuff over and over again. You want to get to new stuff. So I think from a technical perspective, we're motivated to contribute this back so that we don't have to do the same things over and over again.
All right, and time for one more question, and then we'll take the rest off into Slack. So from Beth Carvelli, how do you decide if a project-specific feature or maybe project-originated feature should become part of the product line? And so my addition to that is there a steering group that makes these decisions?
Yeah, like we do have, we call it our product owner sync meeting, and we meet periodically and we get together the product owners from the different projects. And that's where we kind of talk about, the features that are coming up and identifying commonalities, and, where we can recognize, hey, we've got two programs here that need the same thing or pretty close to the same thing. This is a good candidate to get into the product line.
Okay, great. And so I'm also personally interested in this, and I think we have a few more questions on this. And so what I'd like to do is let's open up a separate Slack channel on this, maybe called Product Line, and we can continue the conversation there. So
Okay.
Thank you so much, Diane. And we are going to take a couple-minute break
you.
because we also do need to do a sound check. And in the meantime, we will open up that Slack channel.
Okay.
Thanks
Thank
a
you.
lot.